So usually I start my talks with graphs, stats, and data about how many people have been displaced by disasters around the world, but people get lost in stats and data. So instead, I used this photo of one Guatemalan dad and his kids standing in a field of corn that was both their food and their income. This crop was lost to drought, but people across Central America and around the world are also losing crops from floods, hailstorms, hurricanes, sea level rise, etc. If you live in a place that is increasingly uninhabitable or your livelihood is no longer viable because of climate change, then migration itself becomes an adaptation strategy. Next slide. And although the media increasingly covers displacement as something happening or going to happen in countries of the global south, framed as a discussion about quote unquote climate refugees or mass migrations, neither of which play out empirically, tens of thousands of people are displaced every year right here in Canada. And for those of you from BC, you will recall that in 2017, there were over 65,000 people displaced in BC from wildfire. Next slide. So building on my PhD project in political science that looks at discourse and policy around climate mobilities, my supervisor and I teamed up with the Solution Seeker, which is an NGO in Vancouver, the Climate Migrants and Refugees Project, who wanted to initiate discussions and raise awareness about climate displacement. We had only a 10-month scoping project to help CMRP, the NGO, build up a network of who and identify knowledge gaps and needs, what the concerns are, of various parties and with the intention of setting a future research agenda. Next slide. So we talked to people across Canada and in the US and across BC about what we would need to consider for future research, future collaborative research on how BC can prepare for the movement of people in a changing climate. And some of what we heard was that we need to focus first on internal movements within BC and consider all kinds of mobility, from temporary, short-term acute displacement to proactive relocation or planned retreat of individuals or households who live in increasingly climate risk areas. We need to think about intersectionality, which is about adaptation policy being attentive to the multiple dimensions and structures that produce vulnerability to climate risks and displacement, and that these cannot be addressed independently. We need to understand which scale interventions have the most transformative potential, which of course leads to questions about who has the resources and how different levels of government can work together. Next slide. So for future research, we need to start by understanding what is happening here in BC. This isn't an international issue first and foremost. How have past displacements from the wildfires affected both places and people? And can we use these stories of British Columbians to generate urgency and political will for adaptation efforts? Next slide. So because migration is an adaptation strategy itself, mobility can be used to avoid the type of displacement or movement that erodes human welfare, and therefore it is an important consideration and must be included in our repertoire of adaptation options here in BC. Thank you.
Okay.